Anarchism in the mainstream has pretty much been boiled down to being a nihilist interested in political violence and flamboyant costumes. And it's not like there's never been anarchists who look like that, but it's not really what anarchism is on the whole. Noam Chomsky is probably one of the most famous anarchists of recent times who actually represents what that ideal is meant to look like. He uses Rocker's take on anarchism as a kind of starting point, arguing anarchism as a belief system looks towards the historical development of expanding our freedoms in all areas of both individual and social life. Meaning the central principle here is freedom, specifically freedom that allows you to develop your natural powers, talents, and capabilities. With most anarchists believing we need to remove as much religious and political control over our decision making as is feasible and reasonably possible. And that last part is important because anarchism isn't just against all forms of authority or power, as we see in popular representations, but is a belief that all uses of power and authority need to be justified in their use. Like, anarchists aren't against a mother using physical power to stop her kid from running onto the road, because that's a justified use of power which is preventing harm. That can sound a little broad, so we can try to put anarchism in relation to other political traditions, as Chomsky would describe. He claims that anarchism is what we might call libertarian socialism, which brings together both socialist principles in the general idea of collective freedoms and liberal principles in its focus on individual freedoms. Now, it's more accurate to say that anarchists are socialists rather than liberals, with Fisher stating that every anarchist is a socialist, but not every socialist is an anarchist, along with some of the most important anarchist thinkers, specifically working with the early socialist organizations like Bakunin, placing it firmly within the socialist tradition. But at the same time, anarchism pulls heavily from what would be called the early liberal tradition in Rousseau, Humboldt, and Kant. Kant actually makes a pretty crucial argument for anarchists that the only way we as humans become mature enough to use our freedoms is by first being provided with those freedoms to use. For example, there used to be an argument made by people who looked like the Monopoly Man that you couldn't give the average person the freedom to vote in elections because they lacked the maturity to do so. Kant would argue that the way you become mature enough to use that freedom is by being provided with it in the first place. Whereas we can say that modern liberalism became more concerned with pushing development not through expanding all freedoms, but through developing capitalism that might consequently lead to more freedoms through wealth accumulation. But additionally, on the socialist side of things, we can differentiate anarchism from the average socialist by their belief that the state, or the government as we might call it, is one of the unjustified uses of authority when it allows for a small elite to express control over others by controlling how we produce society, and it goes about this control by owning the necessities to our social existence. General average socialists are against the control of society's necessities by a small economic elite. But anarchists are also worried about the control of state necessities by a small bureaucratic elite as well. Something like the Soviet bureaucracy would be a good example of this. Both are viewed as unjustifiable uses of authority for the anarchist, controlling basic things people need to survive and thrive. Generally, then we can say anarchism is this freedom-centered belief system that is socialist but with classical liberal thoughts mashed in. Chomsky then pushes the idea that there is no real utopia that the anarchist belief system is trying to move towards, but instead is simply a set of principles that he believes need to be realized. Which then makes sense why anarchism ends up changing given the time that it finds itself in, because it has to shift its focus depending on the current authority and power structures in place. Some power structures fade away over time, while other power structures which once appeared justified in new settings now no longer look necessary or justifiable. Which maybe explains why anarchism gets such a bad representation, because it's always having to challenge authority which people have been told their whole life, and even for generations beforehand, is integral for their safety, or is integral for society's development, or maybe even that authority makes up some part of their identity. So then for anarchism right now, Chomsky says that the modern incarnation of capitalism is the main authority structure, which is unjustifiable in its control over our lives. It allows a small corporate elite to control the methods and tools we use to produce society, forces the average person to enter into contracts to work for that elite, and then forces us to work not like humans, but like extensions to machines. And that modern incarnation of capitalism has gotten so bad that, in Chomsky's opinion, he actually views it as fine for the state to be used to combat this corporate control over our lives, despite anarchists generally disliking the state being used to change economic organization. And the plan for anarchism against capitalism, which for Chomsky he categorizes as the anarcho-syndicalist solution, is to encourage the average worker to take up a militant formation against capitalist control, to begin economic reorganization where democratic principles enter into the workplace, providing everyone a say in how we ought to work. This needs to be done prefiguratively, which just means that we need to bring that new kind of organization into being now as an example to others, showing them how they could change things as well. Bakunin describes it as not just bringing the ideas of the future to the present, but also bringing the facts of the future into the present as well. A central aspect of anarchism's core beliefs. Because, like was said at the start, anarchism's central premise here is the historical development of our freedoms and bringing what ought to be our future into the present.